The Velkarith honor guard clocked Rowick's prosthetic hand the moment he stepped aboard, and the sound they made, low, clicking, synchronized, was not a greeting. He'd been warned. The diplomatic briefing had covered it in 2 dry sentences. The Velkarith assessed capability on site, and visible damage to the body was considered prima facie evidence of incompetence. The briefing had not covered what to do when you were the only member of your crew small enough to fit through a 30-centimeter access corridor, and the fate of a peace summit depended on what happened in the next 6 hours. Rowick adjusted his toolkit with his left hand, the prosthetic one, matte gray polymer with fine work actuators in the fingers, and smiled at the honor guard with the particular expression he'd learned meant "I understand your concern, and I am choosing not to address it right now." The Velkarith did not smile back. They were tall and articulated in ways that suggested their evolutionary history had strong opinions about climbing, with carapace plating that shifted color in response to emotional states Rowick hadn't fully cataloged yet. The 2 flanking him had gone a deep, bruised amber. He cataloged that as hostile adjacent and kept moving. The flagship was called the Keth Salvar, which translated approximately as Voice of Ancient Command, and it was the most beautiful ship Rowick had ever been inside and the most confusing, because the Velkarith sense of scale ran large. Corridors wide enough to march 20 humans abreast, ceilings that vanished into architectural dark, and tucked behind the ceremonial chamber, accessible through a panel that the lead engineer had shown him with visible reluctance, a maintenance corridor precisely 31 centimeters wide. "The resonance housing is here," the engineer had said, pointing at a schematic on his display. His manipulator limbs, 4 of them, each ending in a cluster of fine-tipped sensory tools, had hovered over the diagram without touching it. "The crystalline lattice that generates the ceremonial tone. Our instruments show cascading microfractures in the tertiary alignment matrix. We have been unable to reach them." Rowick had looked at the corridor dimensions and then at the engineer's manipulator clusters. "How long have your people been working on it?" A pause that contained multitudes. 11 months. He'd done the math on the way over. 31 centimeters. The smallest Velkarith engineer on record would need at least 60. He'd need to go in on his side, one arm extended, working essentially blind by feel alone. With his right hand, that would have been impossible, too much imprecision in the fingertip sensors, too much risk of shattering the lattice further with a wrong touch. With his left hand, the prosthetic one, he had actuator control down to 40 microns. He didn't mention this to the engineer. He'd learned, over years of being underestimated, that explaining yourself before you'd done anything was a waste of air. The access panel opened on a hiss of recycled atmosphere. Rowick shed his outer jacket, clipped his toolkit to his right forearm where he could reach it one-handed, and went in sideways. The corridor was exactly as narrow as advertised and also dark, lit only by the faint blue-white glow of the resonance housing at the far end. The housing was a latticed sphere about the size of his head, ancient by the look of it, older than the ship, he'd bet, which meant it had been moved here from something older still. The crystalline matrix inside caught the light and scattered it in patterns that suggested it had been, once, extraordinarily beautiful. He could see 3 of the fracture lines without his scanner. A cascade, yes, one original crack that had propagated through sympathetic vibration into 2, then 4, then a web of them running through the tertiary alignment matrix like frost on glass. The Velkarith engineer had been right about what it was. He'd been wrong about whether it could be fixed. Rowick extended his left hand into the housing. The actuators in his fingers read the lattice structure the way they read everything, as a problem of force and geometry, pressure and tolerance. He found the primary fracture by touch, the way you found a loose tooth in the dark, and began applying counterpressure along the fault line. Slow, patient. The work required absolute stillness from the rest of his body, which was currently wedged in a 31-centimeter corridor at an angle his lower back was going to have opinions about later. He was 40% through the primary fracture realignment when the light in the corridor changed. Someone had opened the access panel behind him. He kept working. Whatever was happening at the other end of the corridor, it couldn't matter more than the 40 microns of crystal he was currently persuading back into alignment. Stopping now would propagate the fracture sideways. He had another 4 minutes on this stage, minimum. "Explain," said a voice. The translator in his ear rendered it as a single sharp syllable, but the subharmonics of the original carried something more complex. Command layered over inquiry layered over something he didn't have a word for yet. He didn't look up. "Maintenance," he said in his best and very limited Velkarith. "Resonance housing, crystalline lattice, fracture repair." He paused, applied a fraction more pressure to a secondary fault that was trying to widen, and added, 40% complete, please wait." The silence that followed had a texture to it. He cataloged it as he worked. Not the amber of hostility, not the pale blue he'd come to associate with indifference. Something else. He would figure out what later. 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, he completed the first stage. The lattice shifted. He felt it through his actuators before he heard it, and then the housing hummed. A clear, sustained tone, like a bell struck once and allowed to ring out fully. Roic extracted his hand and turned over carefully in the narrow space. He looked back toward the access panel. The Queen of the Velkarith was lying on her side in the corridor entrance, which was the only way she could have fit, watching him. Her carapace had gone a color he'd never seen before, something between silver and violet, shifting at the edges. She had not spoken again. She was simply looking at the prosthetic hand he was withdrawing from her mother's armor. He looked back at her. He thought with the particular clarity that came from having no good options, "Well, this is a Tuesday." She hadn't ordered him removed. Instead, after a long moment in which her carapace cycled through several colors he was adding to his catalog as rapidly as possible, she said something to the honor guard that Roic's translator rendered as, "Leave us." He heard the honor guard leave. The Queen did not move from the corridor entrance. Roic did not move from the housing. They regarded each other in the blue-white light of the humming lattice, and Roic thought that of all the ways this assignment could have gone sideways, this was at least an interesting one. Working alone with a queen who might kill him was, Roic reflected, not the worst Tuesday he'd had. He'd had a Tuesday on Paul Station involving 3 dockworkers, a customs dispute, and a crate of what had turned out to be live agricultural specimens. He'd had a Tuesday on Kamar where he'd been responsible for keeping a very nervous, very important person alive through a deposition that lasted 11 hours. This was, comparatively, quieter. He turned back to the housing and began the second stage. The Queen was still in the corridor entrance. She was watching his hands, both of them, but mostly the left. He was aware of this the way he was aware of all observation, catalogued, filed, and not allowed to affect his concentration. His left hand moved through the lattice with the patience of something mechanical, which was what it was, and he followed the fracture lines the way you followed a conversation, listening more than speaking. "This was made," the Queen said finally, in Velkarith. Her translator equivalent would have rendered it as built or constructed, but the verb she used had connotations of something more deliberate, made with intent. "Yes," Roic said. He was working around a secondary fracture cluster that required very fine calibration. "Old, 200 years, perhaps more." He paused. "Your mother's." Another silence, her carapace shifted. "Yes." "It's a remarkable piece of work. The original craftsman understood harmonic propagation. He found the deepest of the secondary fractures and began the same counterpressure process he'd used on the primary. It hasn't been sung in a long time. 30 years, maybe." 31, the Queen said. He noted the precision, since she died. "Yes." He worked. The secondary fractures were smaller than the primary but more numerous, a constellation of them, each requiring its own separate alignment. His lower back had progressed from complaint to formal grievance. He ignored it. The prosthetic didn't ache, which was one of its advantages. The rest of him made up for it. "Why do you continue?" the Queen asked. It was a genuine question. The syntax was inquiry, not accusation. Roic considered. His Velkarith was functional but not elegant. He had to choose his words with the care of someone who knew they were spending a limited currency. "Because broken things that still work," he said slowly, "are worth more than whole things that do not." The color shift in the Queen's carapace was pronounced. He filed it as significant without knowing yet what it meant. He heard the outer door of the maintenance bay open. Footsteps, multiple, the particular sound of Velkarith movement, which was always slightly syncopated, the leg joints hitting in pairs rather than alternating. Then a voice, not the Queen's, speaking rapid Velkarith that his translator was only partly keeping up with. Contamination of the resonance matrix by non-organic vibration, which under the caste standards of ceremonial maintenance requires immediate. "Stop," said the Queen. The voice stopped. Roic kept working. He was 60% through the secondary cluster. He would not stop. The master engineer, his translator caught the title, addressed the Queen in tones of careful urgency. He was explaining, with evident expertise, that the prosthetic actuators in Roic's hand generated a vibrational signature incompatible with the sacred resonance frequencies of the Velkarith ceremonial tradition, and that continued operation of said actuators in proximity to the housing would invalidate the resonance entirely, and that the proper remedy was immediate removal of the human technician and a full ceremonial resanctification of the housing before the summit. He was very authoritative about it. He had clearly prepared this argument. Roic finished the secondary cluster. He withdrew his hand briefly, flexed the actuators, felt the familiar slight delay in the ring finger that the technician back on the station kept telling him he needed to bring in for recalibration. Then he said, still without looking at the master engineer, "What is the root frequency of the primary resonance crystal?" Silence. He turned and looked at the master engineer for the first time. He was tall, even by Velkarith standards, and his carapace markings indicated a caste seniority that Roic suspected was supposed to be intimidating. His manipulator clusters were positioned in what Roic had come to recognize as authoritative display. "The root frequency," Roic said again in plain, careful Velkarith, "of the primary resonance crystal. If you have diagnosed the contamination, you know the base frequency. What is it?" The master engineer's carapace went a color Roic had not seen before and filed immediately as something that would have been embarrassing in any species. He had not diagnosed the root frequency. He had diagnosed the symptom, the fractures, without identifying the cause. The cascading propagation hadn't originated from age or impact. It had originated from a sympathetic resonance mismatch that had been present, Roic was now fairly certain, for decades before the Queen's mother died. The armor had been slowly destroying its own lattice every time it was sung. He had found this in 40 minutes of listening to the fractures. The master engineer had not found it in 11 months of looking at them. He didn't say any of this. He turned back to the housing. Behind him, the Queen said 2 words in Velkarith. His translator rendered them as, "You are dismissed." The footsteps of the master engineer and whoever had come with him receded. The outer door closed. Roic released a breath he hadn't been aware of holding and returned to work. The secondary cluster was complete. The tertiary alignment matrix, the one the original diagnostic had flagged, waited ahead of him. He had 28 hours until the summit. He had perhaps 60% of the repair left. "He has held that position for 40 years, the Queen said from the corridor entrance. It was not a defense of the master engineer. It was an observation, delivered in a tone Roic was cataloging as something between wry and weary. "I know," he said. I'm not trying to embarrass him." "You did it anyway." "Yes." He found the start of the tertiary matrix and settled in. "I apologize for that, but he would have had you seal the housing. He cannot fix it because he cannot reach it. He cannot admit he cannot reach it." He paused. "The problem with his solution is that it would have been permanent." The color shift in the Queen's carapace was slow, complex, and remained, for now, beyond his translation. The sabotage was elegant, which told Roic it was the master engineer, because spite at that level of craftsmanship deserved a grudging respect. He discovered it when he returned to the maintenance bay after a 2-hour break. His back had required the intervention, and found his tool authorization codes locked at the system level. Not just access restricted, scrubbed. He couldn't enter the bay. He couldn't access his supplementary kit. He couldn't, technically, be anywhere near the Keth Solvar's repair infrastructure with anything more sophisticated than his bare hands. His bare hands and his prosthetic one. He stood outside the bay door for approximately 30 seconds. Then he did the calculation. Tertiary matrix repair remaining, estimated time with full kit, roughly 4 hours. Time until the cast contamination filing. He'd had an alert on his comm almost immediately after the authorization scrub, activated and required the ceremonial cleansing protocol. 3 hours and change. He had no kit. He had no authorization codes. He had his toolkit clipped to his right forearm, which was basic maintenance equipment and not subject to system-level authorization. He had his left hand. He went back to the corridor. The Queen was not there. She appeared 20 minutes after he'd resumed work, moving quietly for someone in ceremonial carapace, and said nothing when she saw him working without his supplementary tools. She watched instead. He was aware of her watching, and aware that she was not watching the way the honor guard watched, cataloging threat, measuring response time, but watching the way you watched something you didn't have a framework for yet. He was building a calibration tool out of a modified pressure gauge and 2 components from his basic toolkit, running the new tool through tests against the crystal structure before he trusted it. It was an inelegant solution. It would work. "You are improvising," the Queen said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." The tools that were removed, they were necessary. They would have been faster. He ran another test, adjusted the calibration by a degree, ran it again. "This will do." He heard her shift. The color change in his peripheral vision was toward that silver-violet he still hadn't fully categorized. "We do not improvise," she said. "In the maintenance casts, tools are specified. Methods are approved. If the approved method fails, the problem is referred upward until someone has the approved tool." "What happens if no one does?" A pause, "Then the problem cannot be fixed." He looked at the lattice. "This problem," he said carefully, "has been unfixable for 31 years because no one with the right hands was allowed in the corridor." The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than the ones before it. He worked through it, and the calibration tool held, and the tertiary matrix began, painstakingly, to yield. He was at 85% when he got the second alert. The cast contamination claim had been escalated. Under Velkarith ceremonial law, a formal claim required the Queen to respond within 3 hours with either a rejection or compliance. Compliance meant the cleansing protocol. Compliance meant 72 hours. The summit was in 19. He ran the numbers. He could complete the repair in 4 hours. The claim activated in 3. He needed the Queen to invoke a Queen's override, a power that had not been used for a maintenance decision, according to the files he'd been reading on his comm during his backbreak, in 200 years. He could make the argument. He was reasonably good at arguments. But he thought, looking at the lattice, at the fracture lines running through something someone had made 2 centuries ago with extraordinary care, at the specific quality of the silence that fell every time the Queen watched him work. He thought that arguments were not what this moment required. He pressed his left hand fully into the housing, and found the primary resonance crystal beneath the lattice, the one the whole structure was built around. And he did something he wouldn't have tried with a full kit, because it required a degree of actuator sensitivity that made his calibration tool look crude. He coaxed the crystal into a partial resonance. Not the full tone, the lattice wasn't ready for that, the fractures weren't sealed, but a partial resonance, a harmonic suggestion, a ghost of what the housing had been built to do. His left hand translated the crystal's structure into vibration, and the vibration became sound, thin and imperfect and unmistakable. The armor sang. Not loudly, not the full-throated resonance it would achieve when the repair was complete, a whisper of it, a memory. The Queen made a sound he'd never heard from a Velkarith before. His translator offered nothing. It was not a word. He held the partial resonance for 30 seconds. His left hand ached, not the prosthetic, which didn't, but the stump and the nerves that had learned to extend themselves into polymer, a phantom sensation that manifested as something between pressure and heat when he pushed the actuators to their limits. He held it anyway. Then he let it go, and the corridor was quiet. The honor guard had gone still. All of them at the corridor entrance and beyond it, a Velkarith stillness that he'd never seen before, and that meant, he was now certain, something sacred. The Queen invoked the override 40 seconds later. He heard the formal language from somewhere above him. She had straightened up from the corridor entrance, was standing at full height, speaking in the ceremonial register his translator barely kept pace with. The caste contamination claim was suspended. The master engineer's authority over the resonance housing was formally transferred to the Queen's direct jurisdiction. Then she came back to the corridor entrance and looked at him again. "Finish it," she said. He turned back to the lattice. His left hand was still warm with phantom pressure. He put it back to work. The master engineer had friends, and those friends had access to the summit chamber's atmospheric controls, which was the kind of problem Rowick's prosthetic hand couldn't fix. He found out about the atmospheric controls from diplomat Cressida Venn, who found out about them from the summit's advance team, who found out from a Velkarith staff member, whose carapace had gone a very alarming shade of red during what should have been a routine pre-summit walkthrough. Venn passed this information to Rowick along with the information that she had eaten something at the diplomatic reception that disagreed with her in a comprehensive and incapacitating way, and that she would be in the medical bay for at least 4 hours, which was 4 hours longer than the summit could wait. "You'll have to go," she said, which was absolutely not what Rowick's job description said. "I'm maintenance crew," he pointed out. "You're the only human who's spoken to the Queen for more than 30 seconds. You're also the only human on this ship who isn't currently incapacitated." Venn paused. "There are only 2 of us on the crew. The math is not favorable." The math was indeed not favorable. Rowick looked at his prosthetic hand, which was marked with trace crystal dust from the repair, which was now complete. The housing had run its full resonance test an hour ago, and the tone had been extraordinary, clean and deep and complex, nothing like the ghost he'd coaxed out of it the day before. The full voice of the thing. He wiped the crystal dust off his hand. He went to the summit. The summit chamber was large even by Velkarith standards, which meant it was genuinely vast, and it was full of 2 delegations who were currently not looking at each other. The opposing delegation, the Keth Orville, who shared a border and a century of unresolved grievances with the Velkarith, had arrived first and were arranged in a semicircle near the far wall. Their carapaces were reading, to Rowick's now-practiced eye, a uniform cold blue that he catalogued as formal hostility. The leak had reached them. He could tell from the way their attention tracked his prosthetic hand when he entered. He made his way to the Velkarith side. The Queen was present, in full ceremonial carapace, the resonance housing in its display mount beside her throne. The master engineer was present also, stripped of his claim but not of his presence, standing at the edge of the Queen's guard with an expression that Rowick's translator couldn't render but his instincts could. The Keth Orville representative, a being whose caste markings indicated something like a senior diplomat, stepped forward before anyone had formally opened proceedings. She addressed the Queen in rapid Velkarith, her own dialect inflected differently enough that Rowick's translator was working hard. The gist: the Queen had allowed an alien with damaged limbs to handle sacred Velkarith ceremonial artifacts. This was either an insult, deliberate disrespect sent via an unqualified handler, or evidence that the Queen herself lacked judgment. Either way, the Keth Orville could not enter negotiations in good faith with a party who had opened with either malice or incompetence. The Queen had not yet spoken. She was looking at the representative with an expression Rowick couldn't read. He recognized, going to have to do something spectacularly inadvisable. He stepped forward. Both delegations looked at him. The master engineer's carapace went sharply amber. The Keth Orville representative turned with the particular quality of attention one gave to something unexpected and therefore potentially dangerous. Rowick's Velkarith was functional but not elegant. He had on his side precision, the habit of saying exactly what he meant, no more, and the knowledge that in any language, sincerity had a sound that was distinct from performance. "I fixed the armor," he said. He kept his voice level and his eyes on the Keth Orville representative because the argument was with her, not with the room. Not because I was assigned to, because I was the only one who could reach the fractures. He paused, choosing words with the care of limited currency. I have a prosthetic hand. It can reach things that whole hands cannot. Another pause. It can feel things that whole hands cannot feel. The representative was watching him. Her carapace had shifted slightly, not the cold blue of formal hostility, something adjacent to attention. "The Queen's mother made that armor sing," Rowick said. "It stopped singing 31 years ago. I gave it back." He could hear his own Velkarith going slightly wrong at the edges. The vowels weren't right, some of the tonal markers were flat, and he kept going anyway. Not as an insult, not as incompetence, as he didn't have the word. He used a human one in his own language and then translated it inexactly, because it was worth fixing. The room was quiet. He picked up his left hand and held it up, not as a gesture of aggression. He was very careful about that, keeping his elbow at his side, raising only the forearm, so both delegations could see it. The polymer, the fine actuator joints, the trace of crystal dust he hadn't quite gotten off the knuckle of the index finger. "This hand is broken," he said in Velkarith as plainly as he could. "It still works." He looked at the Queen. "So did the armor." The chamber was quiet for 3 seconds, which was long enough for Rowick to consider that he might have just ended the summit single-handedly, and wonder if Ven was going to forgive him. Then the Queen of the Velkarith stood up. The Queen of the Velkarith stood, which meant everyone else sat down. The sitting down happened instinctively. Both delegations, guards, functionaries, the master engineer at the edge of the room. Even Rowick's knees wanted to bend, though that might have been his lower back expressing continued displeasure about the maintenance corridor. He stood, he watched her. She was taller in full ceremonial carapace than she was in the maintenance corridor. The carapace itself was different today, a formal set, ancient by its markings, and she wore it the way someone wears something they've earned rather than inherited. Her coloring had shifted to the silver violet he'd been cataloging since their first real conversation, and he understood now what it meant. He'd had enough data points. "It meant I am attending to this, completely." She spoke. Her Velkarith was, naturally, perfect, formal register, every tonal marker precise, carrying the layered harmonics that indicated not just meaning but authority, and beneath that something else. His translator kept up with the words. It couldn't keep up with the harmonics, but he was listening to those directly. She did not defend Rowick's credentials. She did not argue his rank or his qualifications or the technical parameters of his prosthetic. She was too good a politician for that, and the argument would have been wrong anyway. She said his name, which she had learned during the 2 days they'd spent in a maintenance corridor talking about resonance frequencies and improvisation and broken things. She said it correctly, in the human pronunciation, which must have cost her something in terms of the formal register. Then she said, in the ceremonial voice, that a debt had been given and received. Rowick's translator stumbled on the specific phrasing. It wasn't a debt in the transactional sense, owed, to be repaid. It was debt in the sense of weight, the specific gravity of something someone had given you that you had not expected to receive and could not have asked for. The weight of being known, the weight of being heard. She said he had returned to her, something she had stopped believing was recoverable. The room was very quiet. The Keth Orville representative's carapace had gone through several colors in the last 30 seconds and had arrived somewhere in the silver-blue range that Rowick was tentatively cataloging as moved, which was a category he hadn't expected to be building. The master engineer had gone still in a way that was different from the sacred stillness of the honor guard. This was the stillness of someone who had bet on a particular outcome and was watching the wager fail in real time. The formal caste contamination claim was withdrawn 6 minutes later, moved by 3 members of the Keth Orville's own engineering delegation who had been listening to everything and had, apparently, opinions. Rowick heard this from across the room and filed it under unexpected allies. The summit proceeded. He stood where he'd been placed, off to the side of the Queen's position, behind the formal delegation line, clearly not a diplomat, and watched 2 civilizations negotiate the specific weight of a shared border and a century of grievance. It was meticulous work, the kind that moved in increments, and he respected it the way he respected all fine work. At some point, near the end of the first session, a Velkarith functionary appeared at his elbow and explained, in careful language, that the Queen was requesting his presence as a formal witness to the signing. Not as diplomatic crew, as a witness in the Queen's name. He was a mechanic. He was 34, unremarkable except for one arm, and he had left his tool kit in the maintenance corridor when he came to the summit, because the tool kit didn't exactly read as diplomatic. "Yes," he said, "I'll be there." The signing was scheduled for that evening. In the interim, the functionary explained, there was one more thing. It was customary for formal witnesses to receive the witness markings of the Velkarith, a pigment application to the arm indicating that this being had stood in the Queen's name and attested to an agreement that would outlast them both. Witness markings, the functionary noted, were applied to the left arm, the primary limb, the one whose presence indicated the witness was whole and present. Rowick looked at his left arm. The functionary's carapace shifted to something apologetic. "We could apply them to the right arm instead," he offered. "We have no precedent for." "The left is fine," Rowick said. The functionary looked uncertain. "The pigment adheres to organic material. We do not know if it will." "Let's find out." He was aware, walking to the signing chamber, that this was the calculation he'd been making unconsciously since he'd boarded the Keth Salvar. Every step had required him to extend his prosthetic hand into a situation it hadn't been designed for, and every time it had done what he needed. The lattice, the ghost resonance, the moment in the summit chamber when he'd held it up and let both delegations look. A body's limitations were tactical data. He'd learned that young, in the industrial accident that had taken his hand, and spent 11 years since building a career around the principle. The hand that could reach where whole hands couldn't. The stillness required by fine work, which was the same stillness required for a conversation worth having. He had not come to the Keth Salvar expecting to give a queen back her mother's voice. He had come to fix a piece of equipment that no one else could reach. That was still what he'd done. The signing chamber was smaller than the summit room, intimate, comparatively, the ceilings lower, the lighting warmer. The representatives of both civilizations were arranged around a central table. The documents were present. The functionary guided him to a position beside the Queen's chair, and he stood there with his hands at his sides and his back complaining quietly and waited. The Queen arrived last. She always arrived last. He'd noticed that about her, the way she was never early, never just present when you turned around, but always entered from a direction that required the room to adjust to her. She came in, and the room adjusted, and she took her position at the table, and she looked across at the Keth Orville representative, and something passed between them that Roick's translator couldn't reach, but that looked, to his eye, like the specific exhaustion of two people who had been enemies for so long that the weight of it was almost companionable. The signing happened. He watched it. He witnessed it, which was what he was there to do. Afterward, the Queen came to stand beside him, which was unusual enough that the functionary's carapace flickered. She was carrying a small case. She opened it. The pigment inside was a deep blue-black, and the applicator was a delicate stylus, and she lifted it and looked at him. "Left arm," she said. It was not a question. "Left arm," he confirmed. He extended it, the prosthetic one, the matte polymer, the fine-work actuators, the knuckle that still had a ghost of crystal dust in the joint seam. She turned it palm up, and he let the arm rest in her hands, which were very large and very careful, and she began. The markings went on in silence. He watched them appear on the polymer surface, the pigment adhering, he noted with professional interest, exactly as well as it adhered to organic material, which made sense when he thought about it because the Velkarith had no reason to build pigments that distinguished between types of matter. Pigment adhered to surface. The surface was present. That was all the mathematics required. The master engineer was somewhere at the edge of the chamber. Roick was aware of him without looking. When she finished, the Queen held his arm a moment longer than necessary. Her carapace was the silver violet of full attention. She said something in the ceremonial register that his translator rendered as, "This arm has held what others could not reach. Let that be witnessed." Then she released him. The markings were intricate, more complex than he'd expected, not just pigment but structure, patterns that suggested both function and meaning. He didn't try to read them. He would learn what they meant later from the files and from whatever conversations came next. He was good at learning new languages. He excused himself, because the housing needed a final calibration. He found the maintenance corridor the same way he always found it, by memory now, not by directions. The access panel opened on its familiar hiss. He went in sideways, one arm extended and the other arm marked, polymer, warm with the ghost sensation of someone having held it, guided his toolkit from the forearm clip. The housing hummed when his hand came within range of it, not the partial ghost resonance he'd coaxed out of it before. The full voice, deep and complex, and built to carry across whatever ceremonial space it had originally been designed for. It knew the hand. That was not how crystal resonance worked, technically. He was willing to make an exception. He made the final calibration adjustments, minor, all of them, the sort of tuning that separated good from right. And when he was done, he rested his palm against the lattice one last time and felt the tone travel through the actuators into the stump of his wrist, into the nerves that had learned over 11 years to extend themselves into polymer and call it hand. The armor sang. He listened. Outside, in the signing chamber, two civilizations had written their names beside each other on a document that would outlast them both. He closed the housing. He packed his tools. He went to find Diplomat Ven, who was going to have questions, and the answers to most of them were going to be strange. His left hand carried the marking all the way down the corridor, visible in the blue-white light, and it looked exactly like it belonged there.